Enma is a cursed katana from One Piece. It is one of the 21 great grade swords and is powerful enough to cut a mountain in half with one slice. Stay tuned to see if I can actually build a blade worthy of being called Enma. To start off the build, I have a billet of 1 inch wide by almost half an inch thick W2 tool steel. Aside from being tough as nails, W2 is hands down the best modern tool steel for Hamons. The first thing I do is cut off a little bit of material at the tip at about a 45-degree angle. This is actually the traditional method for forging the tip, but it's not technically necessary for me because I'm starting with a bar of modern steel. Next, I actually forge up the longer side of the bar so that it becomes in line with the short side. This step is actually extremely necessary for traditional bloomery steel, but I'm only doing it on mine because I've never done it before and I thought it would look cool. After forging the tip, you're supposed to forge the muni, or the spine bevels. I decided to not forge those in and grind those in later, so the step that I'm doing next is I'm actually beveling the blade. At first glance, beveling doesn't seem too complicated, but I'm actually doing much more than just thinning the edge. First, I'm establishing the actual bevel line, or the shinogi G. Second, I'm setting the curve of the overall blade shape. And the third, I'm actually beveling the part of the blade opposite of the edge. I have to carefully plan my hits so that the cross-section of the blade is consistent throughout the entire thing, and that it is as close to final geometry as possible. If you look at the blade closely right now, the part of the blade that I beveled and set the geometry is much wider than it is in the back. I have to keep this in mind because the tip is actually supposed to be the thin part. It's supposed to be widest near the Habaki and gradually get thinner and thinner towards the tip. That actually looks very nice. Compared to some of my other builds with all that complicated Damascus and forge welding, it might seem simpler to make a blade like this. But there's actually so much blade and so much geometry I have to keep in mind that it might actually be harder. It's already like a 12-inch blade. As far as how long I want the blade to be, in the anime, the sword is a shape-shifting sword. Odin was like a 4-meter tall person and he wielded it perfectly, but Zoro is like 2 meters tall and it looks just as big on him. So I can't use the anime in terms of reference, so I'm going to be using the history books. A katana has to be 24 inches in length at least, or else it's a wakizashi. I decided to go for about a length of 24.5 to 25 inches. I don't want it to be too big because honestly I don't trust myself to forge a blade that big in the first place. At the time of filming this video, it was around 115 degrees outside. And because it was so hot, I decided to not wear long pants and just go for these short cargo pants. Because I didn't have to do any forge welding for this katana, I had the forge turned down to 1 of 2 burners and only 5 psi. Even though I was outputting around a quarter of the heat that it is when forge welding, I think the garage was still around 140 degrees. You can see it there on my face. I'm pretty much the same color as my shirt. Oh. In between pretty much every heat of this sword, I was going back to the book, The Art of the Japanese Sword by Yoshinda Yoshihara. I wanted every aspect of this sword to be as true to the actual katana as possible. I may not be able to actually execute everything, but if that was the case, I wanted to at least know. I already did something wrong here. You're supposed to isolate the tang from the spine side, not from the edge side. And I only noticed that after making this entire video. So many people do this wrong. The thing that I was pointing at there was something called the yokote line. The yokote is something that you see on all traditional katana, but it takes a lot of work to do. Usually you have to stone polish just the tip for a couple of days just to start seeing it. I wanted this to be as traditional of a blade as possible, so I was going to take it the extra mile later and bring out that yokote. The amount of time it took for me to go from starting billet to finished sword was around 3 to 4 hours. You can tell that it was a while because I'm wearing a different set of clothes here and it's bright again outside. And it shouldn't have taken 3 to 4 hours. It should have taken me around 2. And that's because there was a lot of me just sitting there thinking about what I was doing next. Katana are actually slightly different than every other sword that I know of, in that the bevels from the blade continue all the way through the tang. I've never seen a katana in the book that I was reading without bevels continuing through the tang, but I have seen it on some modern ones where the smiths put their own personal twist onto the blade. Enma is not just a regular katana. It's a katana from one of the most popular anime series of all time. And as a result, a lot of fans of the show are going to have very high standards for the blade that I make. Because of that, there's a little bit of extra pressure on my back when I was making this. I wanted everything to be as good as I could possibly make it. What you see me doing here is fixing the curve of the blade with a piece of wood. The reason that I'm using a piece of wood is because wood is soft enough to where it won't deform the metal at all, but it has enough mass to actually bend it. At this point, I needed to make sure that my distal taper was there. So I took a pair of calipers and measured it from Habaki all the way to tip. And I think I did pretty well. It went from 1.4 inches all the way to 1.25-ish at the tip, which is quite good. I can work with that. If you know a lot about katana, you're probably wondering how come my blade already has a curve in it. Aren't you supposed to get that curve when you quench it? And the answer is both yes and no. If you were to quench it in water, you would get more curve, but I'm quenching it in oil. And when you quench in oil, it actually bends the other way. So I actually have to bend it more than the final bend. And eyeing that out and making sure that the blade is straight is actually a lot of work. I also have to make sure that the edge is centered to the straight blade. And that itself is another can of worms. Calling it there. Now that the blade is finished forged, it's time to get it ready for normalization. Normalization makes it so that the grain size gets smaller and that it heat treats perfectly. I do it in 3 cycles, the first one at 1650 degrees, the second at 1500 degrees, and the third one is at 1350 degrees. In between all 3 cycles, I let it cool to around 700 to 800 degrees.
Edge side down, or else I'll just dig into it.
While the blade was heating up in the oven, I took the time to sweep the floor. I really like working in a clean shop, so I try to do it as often as I can. Once all 3 normalization cycles are done, I take it back to the grinder and I begin hogging off a bunch of material. One of the things that you don't see, but I do for every single blade, is I start with a dull belt to take off all of the forge scale, and then I transition to a much sharper belt once I get through that forge scale. The reason that I do this is because forge scale is actually quite hard. If I don't grind it off with a dull belt, I'll be ripping apart my sharp belts, thereby decreasing the lifespan of them and wasting a lot of money. If you want a frame of reference for how expensive belts are, that purple belt that you saw me use was $22. And the blue belts are not that much better at $18. And any of the red ones that you see me use are around $10 to $12. So every single belt that I use and throw away is just money being burnt. Now that the blade is rough ground, it's time to clay the spine and get ready to heat treat the blade. The clay that I'm using here is 2 parts. The first part is just ground up forge scale, and the second part is something called satanite. Satanite is a refractory cement. You usually mix it with some water and line the inside of your forge with it, but it also works really, really well for putting hamons in blades. And I haven't ever found anything better, which is why I'm sticking with it for this katana build.
Pour too much water in this. Oops, that was too much water. Oh, maybe that was perfect amount of water. Alright, satanite is pretty evenly mixed. Get some of the scale. Mixed with some chili powder. It smells so good that I want to eat some.
Steak night actually smells a lot like instant ramen, which is why I mentioned in the last clip that I kind of want to eat it. I don't know if it actually tastes like instant ramen, but I don't really want to test it out. The thin lines that you see me putting on the blade here are actually called ashi lines. The ashi lines help the blade in terms of function, and they give the hamon its actual shape. It helps with function because if the hamon line is too straight, that can actually peel the blade apart. These ashi lines make it so that those two hard and soft steels blend together and don't want to peel apart. In terms of shape, it's actually too complicated to explain, but just imagine that these lines are going to help cause a fiery effect. I'm not actually using my heat treating oven to quench the katana here. I'm actually just using the forge. This is because, on average, the hamons that you get out of a forge quench are much better than that of the heat treating oven. I have to be super careful with my temperatures here. If it overheats, the blade could crack. If it's underheated, there'll be no hamon. And if I soak it for too long, the hamon will actually have less activity. That's why I have the garage lights turned off and I have the doors mostly closed. It's probably not great for my lungs, but it'll help produce a better hamon. The thing that I use to check the temperature is a magnet. If the magnet sticks, it's too cold. If it doesn't stick, it's past critical temp.
That's hot. Ready? That's fucking good. I'm not gonna risk anything. It's going straight into the temper. I will discover whether it went well or not after 2 hours. I sure hope this isn't cracked. That'd be really sad and really funny. Let me get the clay off first.
The blade that you see me using here to scrape off all the clay is a karambit that I forged out 4 years ago but never finished. The fact that I have to scrape off the clay here and it just hasn't popped off at all is probably a good sign. The thing that I'm going to do next is take it back to the grinder and reveal some fresh steel. Usually after you quench and you want to put a hamon in the blade, you can see the hamon once you grind off all of those dark oxides. And that's exactly what I'm doing here.
That is not good at all. You have a really nice hamon on like heart of this blade. We might have to re-quench this. It's far too close.
At this point, I already decided to requench the blade. But what was I going to do different? I had a theory that the ashi lines were too thick and the entire blade cooled a little bit too slowly, and that made it so only the edge was hard. I decided to take another look at the hamon on Enma and do much wider swaths of clay. Maybe this would help the edge quench a little faster.
You know, the sketchy heat treat is definitely explained by the fact that it didn't bend at all.
You can see here, my clay is much more aggressive, and I didn't actually put any ashi lines. I was hoping that this would make the hamon pop a little bit better and help with the heat distribution. Another thing that I'm going to try to do different the second time is to heat up the blade a little bit more. I had a sneaking suspicion that even though the magnet didn't stick to the blade anymore, that W2 wants a faster quench than I can give it. So I gave it a little bit more heat than last time, and I had my fingers crossed the entire time. Please don't flash, please don't flash, please don't flash.
If I hear any pings, I'm gonna jump out the window There's no window in the garage, so I don't know how I'm gonna do that.
Now that the blade is tempered after the second quench, it's time to straighten it. After the second quench, the blade actually had pretty major warpage. So after the second tempering cycle at 425 degrees, I took it over to the vise and used my 3-prong straightening jig to try and get things as straight as I could. You can see here, I'm really cranking that vise down as hard as I can, and the blade bends the other way a lot, so I have to be careful not to snap it. The little glimpses that I had of the Hamon at this point were really confusing. I had what looked like eyes, like the letter I, like capital, like an I-beam kind of thing. I've never seen that in Hamon before, and I thought it was just because of the decarb. So I kept on grinding, and I didn't really look back. I'm gonna file test this one last time. After file testing it to make sure that the entire edge was hard and that the entire spine was soft, I took it over to the anvil and used this carbide hammer from Coronat Gamiko on Instagram to get some minor warps out of the blade. I got it globally straight on the 3-prong jig, but not perfectly straight. Now that it was straight, it was time to get those shoulders ground into the spine. You can already see here, I have the shoulder ground into the edge side, but not the spine side. I had to make sure that these shoulders were fairly square, so I used this 90-degree jig to make sure that they were square. I'm hungry. Oh. How? It's amazing that at this point I still don't know what I'm looking at. The entire edge is hard. But this Hamon looks so freaking weird. I have a sneaking suspicion. I kind of hate this. I think this is a piece of garbage. I think I want to forge another one. It's going to take a lot of time. But in the end, I think it'll be worth it. Like, it looks cool. It would pass the random observer's eye test. But it's not Enma. I don't know what the play is. I think this is a piece of garbage. So yeah, I decided to just reforge the entire thing. I actually finished a lot more than I showed on camera. I had the blade ready to hand sand and move on to the next step. But it was just so like wishy-washily good that I wanted to just start fresh and make a new one. I did everything better on the second one compared to the first one. I forged the spine bevels, I had the perfect distal taper, it was perfectly straight, everything was better. Oh my gosh. You can see here, it's got like the perfect amount of bend, and here it is compared to the first one. I did all 3 normalization cycles the same as the first one, I ground off all the oxides, and then I got it ready for quench again. You can see that look on my face is just full of tiredness and annoyance, and that's because I didn't quench katanas 3 times during this video, I actually quenched it 4 times. This is the second time I'm quenching the second forged katana. The first run of the second katana, I didn't heat up the kiln enough, I didn't let it soak. And the second time, I let it soak, I heated up the oil, and you'll see in a little bit, it looks quite good. This is the Hamon that you see when you think of Enma. I'm so happy I did everything so many times just to get it right. And now, it's time for a field trip. The first store on the list was Home Depot. I needed to get a longer PVC pipe for my ferric chloride because the one I already have right now is only 2 feet tall, and the katana is approximately 2.5 feet long. I could only buy it in 10-foot sections, so I used the saw of the worker there, and I cut a 3-foot section, so I had a 3-foot section and a 10-foot section.
Why is this $17?
The next store on the list was a place called AZ Metals. I really needed a big sheet of brass to use as the guard for Enma, so I went here and got a nice slab of brass. Another thing that I got from this place was some of their cutoffs that were really, really cheap, and some sheet steel so that I could make a fume hood for my forge. The next place on the list was a store called Woodworker Source. If you look at Enma, Enma has a purple handle, and I don't have any purple wood on hand. So I went there, looked for some purple heart, got some help from the people working there. I actually got to meet the store owner. He was super nice, super helpful, and he helped me pick out a nice board of purple heart. As a knife maker that gets most of their materials online, I don't spend that much time in woodworking warehouses, so I spend a lot of time to just look at everything in the shop. Now that the field trip's over, it's time to start working on some fittings for Enma. The first thing that I'm working on is the Habaki. The Habaki is sort of a copper spacer that fits right under the blade and goes up against the guard. I'm making it from a piece of copper, because that's traditionally what the Habaki were made of. What you just saw me do was use a cross peen and peen out two sides of a thick sheet of copper. And once I hammer it to a certain point, it stops moving under the hammer. So I take it to a torch, I heat it up to about a red temperature, and then I dip it in water. This softens the copper so I can keep hammering it and thinning down those two sides. Because copper work hardens so fast, I had to keep heating it up and quenching it in water, and I think I actually did that around 10 times for just this one piece. Now that the copper was at an adequate thickness, it was time to take it over to the post vise and begin bending it into that deep U shape. This is super tricky because that thick part in the center has to stay in the center. It has to be behind the spine of the blade. The copper at this point was pretty springy. I might not have annealed it correctly the cycle before, and so this step right here was a lot more difficult than it should have been. One of the cool things about Habaki is that they are custom fit to every katana that they're for. Because every katana has a different shape and slightly different geometry, every Habaki is also subsequently different. And so what I'm doing here is I'm heating up the tang so that I can hammer the Habaki on top of the tang and not risk any cracking. This is actually the second Habaki I've ever made. The first one I made for a Tanto that I brought to Blade Show, and it took me an entire day just to make the Habaki. Making the Habaki is one of those things that sounds super simple, but is in reality pretty difficult. It's ugly as hell right now, but it'll get better. You can see here that the blade is pretty much final ground. I didn't show any of the grinding for the second katana because you've already seen so much of the grinding for the first one, and I thought that it would get boring. I think I actually got enough footage for this video to make a 2-hour long video if I were to show everything. But a 2-hour long video where a lot of the stuff is repeated is not that good of a video. One of the things that you don't really see about Habaki is that the spine is inset into the thicker part, so you usually have to file out a channel on the top of the Habaki. The next part of building a Habaki is definitely the trickiest. You have to file or grind a piece of copper into the shape of a wedge that fits exactly into the negative space between the front of the tang and the front of the Habaki. Okay, I might lose my fingers, but it'll be worth it in the end. As you can see here, I opted to use the grinder because I hate filing small things, and I ground it into the shape of a wedge. I decided to start using a pair of tongs to hold them because copper heats up so fast when you grind it that you actually spend more time cooling the copper than you do grinding. I don't know if this is small enough, but we'll do a test fit. With some luck, this might just work. This is definitely the most finicky part of making the Habaki, like I said before. You have to make sure that it fits perfectly against the shoulder of the tang to the blade transition, and you also have to make sure that you can take it off and put it back on. Okay.
Let's solder this thing.
Oh yeah, I didn't mention it before, but that copper wedge has to be soldered to the Habaki itself. Traditionally, this was done with silver solder, but I couldn't find silver solder within 2 days, so I used some lead-free solder that was meant to be used for copper or brass or any of those other alloys. First, I put 2 small bars of the solder right on top of the wedge, and then I covered those with some liquid flux. Next, I used a blowtorch and heated up the entire thing till it was around 400 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I knew it was the right temperature because the solder melted right into the negative space between the wedge and the Habaki. After I got it sort of glued together, I flipped it over and I heated it up a little bit and I began pushing some solder into that space. I didn't want to get this too hot or else the wedge would fall right out, but I also wanted it to be hot enough to melt the wire as I pushed it into the Habaki. This definitely isn't how you're supposed to do this, but I did this the first time on my Tanto, and if it worked the first time, I can probably get it to work the second time. With the Habaki now soldered together permanently, it was time to take it to the grinder and begin finalizing all of those faces.
There's supposed to be a void here because the wedge doesn't go all the way to the top, but I accidentally filled that void with solder, so I need to melt it out. Oh. Okay, it's coming out.
Okay, now that the Habaki's actually finalized, it's time to grind all those faces in. The thing about Habaki is that it needs to be thicker near the base than it is at the top, and it should flow pretty cleanly into those spine bevels. I was constantly checking by putting it on the katana, taking off a little material, going back and forth. I think I did that around a dozen times, but I think in the end, it was definitely worth it. Here's the finished Habaki next to what I started with. Up next on the list, I had to start making the guard. Enma has a really weird looking guard, and it's also fairly thick. So I got a piece of 3/8 inch thick brass from AZ Metals, and I was planning on grinding it into the correct shape.
Blade. Checkmark Habaki's been created. Seppa is very easy. The Tsuba is going to be something like and then I'll have like a blade cut out here. And it'll be like a hole. That looks disgusting. The blade is 2 pounds. And this guard material is almost 2 pounds.
Now I had to figure out the best way to inscribe 3 circles into the square and use up as much of the square as possible. Now that I had it sketched out, I had to find a way to get it actually onto the brass itself. And the method that I came up with was to scribe lines according to how far the circles were on the drawing and put them on the brass and hope that they were right.
This far from the bottom. Oh my gosh, that should have been obvious. If these two are meant to fit exactly in between here, of course they're 1.75. That was planned. You know what? It's probably because this is too slow. This is the one time I didn't search up the adequate drill speeds. That was perfect.
Now that I had all 3 holes drilled and countersunk, it was time to move on to the next few handle pieces. The next part I'm working on is the handle itself. Now, traditionally, katana handles were made out of softer wood like poplar, but Enma is purple, and I didn't really trust myself to dye poplar purple, so that's why I went with Purple Heart. The first thing that I did was cut myself around a 1-foot slab, and then I cut that in half lengthwise, so I had 2 pieces that I could sandwich together and carve out the tang of the blade. I had to make sure that these pieces were as flat as possible, because if they were warped and then I squeezed them together while they were gluing, that pressure could open up that glue joint sometime later, and I don't want this thing to fall apart like 4 or 5 years down the line. Now, making these two handle blocks is actually more complicated than it seems. You have to be a woodworker, and I'm not a woodworker. You're supposed to carve out the outline of the tang and then chisel away the exact negative of the tang itself, and it has to sort of fit like a glove. All right.
Wait, this wood is so hard. Oh man. Is there a faster way to do this?
I decided to change my plans entirely and stray off the traditional method of making the handle. I decided to thin down the two pieces and actually make a frame-handled knife. It sounds weird, but I'm also going to bed it with epoxy later, so I won't lose that glove-type fit that I would get if I had actually carved it out perfectly. You can see here, this is going to be the center section that's going to be sandwiched with 2 more blocks of wood, and I was checking the fit up to make sure that it went on easy and wasn't too loose. One of the things that you might not know about wood is that it can warp. If you cut it in half, those two pieces might have differing levels of strain. So what I was doing here was heating it up and bending it just like I would a knife.
That actually worked.
Now that I had my centerpiece pretty much perfectly straight, it was time to finalize the fit up and get it glued to those 2 sandwich bread pieces or whatever you want to call them. Here, I was testing the fit up of all 3 pieces against the handle. I wanted it to be pretty tight, but not too tight. And then once that was good, I used some Type-On 3 and I began slathering all 3 pieces in glue, and I clamped them up.
I'm definitely using the worst possible tool for this job. Sandwich. This is definitive proof that I am not a woodworker. Okay.
Now that the handle block was glued and clamped, it was time to work on the Seppa. Katana actually have 2 sets of Seppa, one underneath the Habaki and one right above the handle. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a thin sheet of brass, I drew a rough outline of the blade shape, and then I used a jeweler's saw to actually carve out most of the insides.
Okay.
Now it was a matter of just using a really small diamond file and spending a copious amount of time to get this to fit up perfectly to the tang itself. If you've seen my other videos, you know that I always spend so much time filing out these guard slots, but this was next level. Every single one of the parts that slid onto the tang has to be the shape of the tang. If it was a rectangle like all my other ones, it would wobble back and forth. So this was just so much more difficult.
Oh. Would you look at that?
The cool thing is that now that I have my first Seppa made, I can actually use it as an outline for all my other pieces. I can't trust it too closely though, because the tang tapers. So every single one that goes down the tang has to be smaller and smaller. So I had to keep that in my mind as I filed out all of these slots.
All right.
What I didn't know at this point was that the Seppa was the easy part, and filing the slot on the guard was actually going to be the hard part. The Seppa was around a 1/16 of an inch thick, but the guard was 3/8 of an inch thick, and it was all solid brass. So I had to find a way to file out the channel and then make it actually fit the tang. It probably didn't look like it, but filing that slot so that it fit perfectly to the tang took me around 5 to 6 hours. I didn't want to show it on camera because even if you time-lapse 6 hours of footage of you doing the same thing, it just looks boring.
is 1 pound, 12 ounces. Let's see how much it is after I get the circle grounded.
Jesse, you're wasting so much material. You're just turning it into dust and putting it in your grinding bucket. Yes, I am. I'm not even going to be apologetic about it. It was super satisfying. I was actually surprised at how long this purple belt lasted me. I used it to rough grind both katana, and it was still sharp enough to shred this brass. After I got the profile roughed in, I took it to the sander, and I got my faces as clean as I could get them.
1 pound.
Now that I had pretty much all the handle pieces roughed out, it's time to do something that you definitely didn't expect. Katana aren't actually flat ground. They're convex, and they come to a 0 grind. So what I did here was I took it to my 400 grit Otoma diamond stone, and I made it so that it converged to a 0 edge. After I had it 0 ground and definitely sharp enough to cut me, I took it over to my hand sanding station and I began polishing the entire blade. The blade was actually long enough to where I couldn't get it all in one sweep, so I had to hand sand the front half of the blade and then the back half of the blade on both sides. So there were actually 4 different positions that I had to hand sand this blade. What you see me doing here is polishing just the tip so that I could get that yokote line pretty much perfect. It's definitely a lot harder to do with sandpaper and not with stones, but I actually think I did pretty well. The next thing on the list for hand sanding was the spine bevels. These have to be sharp and crisp, and they have to almost look like they can actually cut something. So what I was doing here was I was using a file to make sure that it was perfectly centered and perfectly crisp. I did my traditional hand sanded finish for my Hamon blades. I went from 150 grit to 400 grit to 600 grit. I feel like 600 grit finishes give the best Hamons. They don't make it completely shiny, which adds texture to the Hamon, which I really like. Once the entire blade was adequately hand sanded to 600 grit, I wrapped it in some shop cloth, and then I got ready to finish all of the handle pieces. Up next was actually shaping the handle block. If you looked at the piece of wood that I glued together, it's much blockier than you would imagine a katana handle. So I carved off a lot of extra wood and then I took it to the sander and I began roughing in the shape. I made sure to check with my primary sources a lot because I wanted the curve of this handle to pretty much be exactly what I saw in the anime.
I think it's time we drill a hole.
One of the things about katana is that they're actually held together not by any kind of glue, but by a tight fit to the handle block and 1 or 2 bamboo pins. I had to make sure that the block of wood was at the final position on the tang. If they were offset and I put a pin in it, it would actually create space as opposed to tightening everything up. Now that I had my holes drilled, it was time to bed the tang. The reason that I'm doing this is because I did that frame handled construction, the cross section of the inside of the handle was actually just a rectangle, not matching that of the tang. So I put some Vaseline on top of the tang, mixed some epoxy, poured it into the handle, and then I stuffed it back on the tang and took it off 4 to 5 hours later when the epoxy was just tacky. This will make it so that it has a glove tight fit on the tang.
Okay.
Now that the handle block was pretty much mostly finished, aside from hand sanding and oiling, it was time to make the second Seppa. I'm not going to bore you with too many of the details because it was pretty much the exact same as the first one. Now that the handle pieces are pretty much finalized, it's time to etch the Hamon into the blade. I was mixing together a 1:5 mixture of ferric chloride to water. It's a little bit less concentrated than my 1:4, but I realized that it actually doesn't matter for Hamons. I made sure to clean the blade extremely well with just regular dish soap and a sponge, and then it went into the mixture for 2.5 minutes. After the 2.5 minutes was over, I took it out, washed off all of the ferric, and then I took it to my hand sanding room, and I used a 5,000 grit sandpaper to wipe off all of those dark oxides, but leave the etch spine. A lot of times, I see Hamons described as trapped souls within steel. And if you look at this one, it really does look like that. I decided to do only 2 cycles of etching and polishing because I think a more subtle Hamon on Katana looks a little bit better. If it's too much contrast, it looks like it's not supposed to be there. Now that the blade was pretty much finished, it was time to polish up all of the handle pieces and get it ready for final construction. Originally, I thought I could just use the buffer to do that, but it came to my mind that if those buffing threads caught onto the Habaki, they would throw it across the room and end up breaking it. So I switched tactics and began using a really fine surface conditioning belt on the grinder. Now it's time to hand sand the Purple Heart handle. The thing about Purple Heart is that the higher finish you sand it to, the deeper the color will be when you oil it. So what I did here is I started at 150 grit, I went to 400 grit, 600 grit, and then I actually think I finished it off at 1500 grit. One of the things about this piece of wood is that I hand-picked it so that it would have a lot of those curls. The curls are those tight lines that you see that actually look different from different angles. After the handle was finished hand sanding, it was time to add those flower-looking ornaments on top of the handle.
You know, that's actually not bad.
This is another one of those parts of Enma that looks different in every scene in the anime. Sometimes it's inset, sometimes it's poking out, sometimes you see the individual lobes. I combine all of them, and I was gonna inset it a tiny bit, but still have it mostly protruding out of the handle. What I was doing here was marking exactly which way I was gonna put it on the handle every time, so that if I scribed the outside and rotated it around 180 degrees, I would know. The tool that I'm using here for my very minor inset is just a Dremel Micro with some weird diamond burr. I don't know if it was the best option, but it was what I had on hand. I didn't use epoxy here. I used a bunch of super thick cyanacrylite, which is an industrial grade super glue. I knew that it would hold. You're not really gonna put any pressure onto this itself. Like, you might touch it a few times, but it won't be near enough force to rip it off. To give these flowers a little more depth, I used a triangle file and filed away those corners. It would make it sort of look like each of the lobes was round and protruding even more than they were. With those flower ornaments completely finished, it was time to move back to the guard. The guard at this point was like 90 degrees, and if you held it in your hand, it would cut into the top of it. So I angled my table and ground these really nice chamfers on the side. I did not want this guard to dig into the user's hand. It's time to move on to the finishing touches. Enma has these sort of gold rings covering its handle, and I think they were supposed to be metal in the anime, but the thing is, this is another one of those things that look different in every scene. Sometimes it was inset into the wood, sometimes it was protruding. I decided that protruding would be a little bit cooler, so I took this golden cord and I wrapped it around the handle in the 2 positions that I saw it on the katana. Traditional katana handles always have silk wrap that look like diamonds, but Enma doesn't have that. And that is another reason that I decided to use this golden cord, because I like working with cord. It's really satisfying, and I also think it looks really cool. That looks pretty good. So after 3 long weeks of work and countless failures, this build is finally coming to an end. I hope you enjoyed watching me build this katana. With all that said, I present to you Enma. Now for the final step, is to give this thing an edge. The katana was already 0 ground, but it wasn't technically sharp. So I took it to a 3000 grit Trocera Waterstone, and I spent half an hour giving this thing its final edge. Yes, sir. My vise is now wet. That can cut a limb off.